We're finally here, one of the most iconic deaths in anime history, and I still find it to be surprisingly effective. I think part of this plot beat's effectiveness comes from how the episode is structured to play with your emotions. It starts by focusing heavily on Hughes' flashback to a conversation with Roy and his investigation of Lab 5. The emphasis on Hughes' relationship with Roy and the dreamlike lighting here, as well as the silent atmosphere of the following scene, immediately tells you something will be different about this episode, and we're given a frightening confirmation of that fact right before the opening plays. The ominous words of the Führer's secretary, combined with a scene from just the previous episode where we see her mercilessly killing her own subordinate, marks her saying shit like "we will purge this corruption" as a moment of foreboding that makes you fear for one of the most likable characters in the show. Flash the title card and things are looking even worse for him than we could have imagined. Oddly enough though, instead of letting us stew in the dread of Hughes potentially dying, we're actually given reason to believe that there's nothing to worry about right after this scene. By giving up on a search for the Philosopher's Stone, Ed essentially takes away any reason Hughes has to put himself in unnecessary danger, and as a result, the tone of the scene is a lot more upbeat. There's triumphant music playing in the background, all the characters are really happy, and the brothers are finally moving on from this incredibly dangerous journey. Of course, this is just an act that they're putting on so no one else gets involved in their shit, but it still gives us hope that maybe Hughes will back off and survive this ordeal after all. This is what I meant by the episode structure playing with your emotions. Instead of constantly reminding you of the danger a character is in, like the episode Creative Human for example, this episode attempts to lure you into a false sense of security, so the dread that comes from realizing that this plot thread isn't actually wrapped up as neatly as you'd like to believe hits you much harder than it otherwise would have. The way this scene is presented gives me a sense of finality, one that's reinforced by the focus of the episode actually slipping away from Hughes entirely, centering more on Ed and Nell's departure from Central, and even giving us an update on whatever Scar is up to. It starts to resemble a much more ordinary episode, with us getting further and further away from the danger we were previously made aware of. With the seamless refocusing of the narrative, we might even forget that what happened at the beginning of the episode did indeed happen, but that facade almost immediately comes crashing down as the show cuts back to Hughes raising all sorts of death flags for himself. The entire latter half of this episode becomes an emotional roller coaster, using moments of both anxiety and relief similar to the office and hospital scene earlier on, but this time in a more immediate, quick, and successive sequence of events. Every bit of hope is followed up by a severe moment of terror. Hughes makes a breakthrough in his investigation, the military makes its move faster than we could have seen coming. Hughes figures out he's being set up so he can at least go unprepared. Les manages to take him by surprise anyway. He manages to fend her off, and he even receives backup in the form of Maria Ross. Ross looks at a photo of his family with absolute disgust. This is already something that on its own is completely out of character for her, but combined with a previous scene of Hughes thinking twice about telling her what he's learned, and now the danger that we thought he was able to get so far away from is closer to him than ever. Even when it's time to kill off the guy, the show can't help but absolutely torture you for ever liking this character in the first place. He actually manages to get the drop on Envy here, and succeeds at fending him off. Again, it gives you the supreme glimmer of hope, because he did it. He killed his assailant, and his survival is all but guaranteed now. The shot that follows of Hughes walking away is the perfect representation of this episode's structure, and how it makes the tragedy of this situation hit so hard for the viewers. As soon as Hughes walks off frame, and around the time when you're likely to feel relieved by how the situation played out, envy silently rises, and all the relief you felt, all the confidence in Hughes living to see another day, immediately just disappears. Something about this moment just gets me every time I watch it. For some reason, the shot always comes much more quickly than I'm expecting. I always think there's going to be an extra line of dialogue or a longer dramatic pause before it happens, but the way Envy cuts all the bullshit, says one line, and just executes a man is freaking bone-chilling to me. It's hard to swallow, a gut punch that makes it abundantly clear that he was never safe, that the only reason he had survived this long was because the homunculi were toying with him, and it's a stellar, incredibly handled death scene. I also really appreciate how this flashback conversation between Roy and Hughes was handled. It gets cut short at the beginning, and we only get to see the rest of it after, well, shots are fired. What I like about this flashback is that aside from these two scenes, we barely see any interaction between these two throughout the rest of the episode. All we get is a phone call where Hughes is shown to be avoiding conversation with the guy, and after we see the final piece of the flashback, we start to understand why he did that. It's something indicative of the nature of their relationship in general, with Hughes opting to support him from the shadows, and it ends up adding to the tragedy of the situation pretty substantially, since it's because of Hughes' commitment to the role that he ends up undermining his ability to support Roy to the fullest. He spends so much of his time keeping secrets, and yet the moment it matters most, when all the chips are down and he needs to get the information he's found out there, he's unable to. Out of good intentions, he indirectly caused a situation where his death would be for nothing, which fucking sucks. I also love how the show fades into this flashback from Hughes, but when it fades out, we see Mustang looking out of a train window, implying they're both thinking back on the same memory for wildly different reasons probably. This, for some reason I can't quite put into words, makes me even sadder. One thing I find a tad bit manipulative was the use of Alicia's character during Hughes' funeral. Using an emotional and screaming child as a way to evoke sadness in the audience is just lazy, not to mention her dialogue goes on for a bit too long, and all I got from it was
tragedy, ain't it?
I don't think it ruins the episode or the drama in this scene by any means. In fact, I actually think it's impressive just how effective the scene is at naturally getting me invested, even with this cue card constantly trying to distract me and telling me how I'm supposed to feel. I could definitely do without that though, as the silence of his family and downtrodden facial expressions of all the soldiers saluting are more than enough to tastefully convey how well respected Hughes was and what a shame his death is. Honestly, this close-up of Mustang just staring down at his closest friend being buried in front of him could have been the entire scene, and I wouldn't complain. His final response to Hughes' death is also incredibly powerful. I especially like how the music is used during this moment. At the beginning, when Mustang is busy deriding Hughes as well as himself, there's nothing playing in the background.
殉職で2階級特進
ヒューズ准将か。私の下について助力すると言っていたやつが、私より上に行ってどうするんだ。バカ者が。かつて私は人体錬成の理論を組み立ててみたことがある。今必死でそれを思い出していたよ。錬金術師とは嫌な生き物だ。エルリック兄弟が絡んでいることならなぜ私に報告しなかった。
But when Riza explains to him what Hughes' intentions were, this track plays.
の胸の内にしまい、大佐が安心して上を目指せるように。
With the way the music instantly kicks in here, it feels as though he was trying to hold back his emotions by focusing on a bunch of different things at the beginning, but hearing someone break down how supportive Hughes was suddenly overwhelmed him, and the emotions he was trying to suppress finally came to the forefront since he could no longer keep himself from grieving over the loss of his friend. Even though he's kind of far away here, you can see this in his body language. He silently puts on his hat and lets his arms dangle defeatedly. He may be trying to hide it as shown by how distant the camera is from him at first, but we can easily tell that he's crying based on his line of dialogue and Riza's expression changing as she looks at his face. And of course, we see him crying at the end for confirmation. Man, I really like that the show let this reactionary face speak for itself here and didn't make Hawkeye a freaking idiot for the sake of spelling out this point in a way that's just moronic and completely unrewarding for the viewers. Anyways, the final scene of this episode is amazing too. While it starts off with Winry maybe praising the Hughes family a bit too much, Ed complaining about Hughes always bothering him does a lot to offset all of the excessive romanticization of his character that was going on in the scene, while also serving as a nice bit of dramatic irony since, you know, he's unknowingly saying this shit about a dead man. But goddamn is this a chilling end to an episode. It's such a weighty and heartfelt send-off to this character, and the way the music cuts off as the train passes by the station is just... Fuck, man, it kinda hurts. No question, this is a 10 for me. Episode 26, Her Reason. Now, this episode is pretty light on actual story progression, but it makes for a surprisingly nice change of pace from all the doom and gloom we've been experiencing recently. Something I like about the way O3 specifically handles its character comedy is it doesn't just make its characters play out their gimmicks thoughtlessly. For example, when the group first makes it to Rush Valley, the show isn't just content with letting Winry geek out about the automail on display and have that be the entire joke. Before she can really get going, we're interrupted by a woman gushing over a ring in a nearby shop. Then when we pan over to Ed and Al, Winry is suddenly missing, and a few seconds later you figure out she's doing the exact same thing but over some automail across the street. It's inventive, set up in a way that catches you off guard and allows the joke to land when it would have otherwise felt like a bland gimmick. When Ed is called the Bean Sprout, he of course blows up in typical Ed fashion, but instead of just making him the butt of the joke and calling it quits there, Winry actually gets just as offended after this guy insults her automail as well. The show is great at mixing things up and keeping its gags fresh. It's a big part of why this side of the characters in O3 doesn't get annoying. Even before they really start to subvert the joke here, I find the way this guy moves his arms to cover and then reveal Ed's face as it changes from normal to angry to be really funny. Aside from not being repetitive as fuck, the jokes also manage to feel appropriate in the moment. The opening scene is a great example of this, as it does a fantastic job of shifting tones from the last episode to this one. As the show cuts to each individual item that Ed wants to be reimbursed on, none of the characters really comment on his very strange purchases. They just say what it is and cut to the item as it starts to get more and more childish with each reveal. What I like about this is A, because none of the characters say anything, we're left to really think about how juvenile these items are. Seriously, Ed, I can understand snacks and comic books, but I don't think there's any entertainment to be gained from toys for anybody over the age of 4. And B, because it feels like these characters are actually people and not just lazy excuses for gags. Throughout the entire scene, Mustang is just completely unamused, which does add a bit to the hilarity of the situation, but it also feels appropriate given what he just went through in the previous episode. It's a great way of easing the audience into a more lighthearted tone while not completely undercutting the tragedy we just experienced. This scene is nuanced and balances two very different tones effectively, something I can actually say for the entirety of the episode. While being a pretty effective comic relief episode for the most part, it also serves as a way of fleshing out Winry's character more by having her deal with some insecurities of her own and tying those insecurities into her growing concerns over Ed and Al. We're given a really good idea of just how much Winry values her mechanic skills here. She gets upset when others mock her automail, completely flips her lid when Ed himself does something that implies that he can't rely on her work, and is ultimately reassured once Ed finally talks about how much he values her support. This show even parallels Winry's and Ed's relationship with Paninia's and Dominic's relationship. I like that during this talk, Winry can't help but relate to Panini wanting to show that Dominic's automail is incredible. It's perfectly conveyed with only the slightest change in expression and a soft smile, and you can immediately tell that she's thinking about Ed here and her own desire to convince him of the same thing with her automail, which is what leads her to suggest a competition between the two of them. It surprises me just how seamless the writing and progression in this episode is when you take a moment to really think about what's happening. Panini is a good example of this. I didn't care for her much at first, but she actually works well in this plotline. Her learning to view the automail she's been given as a genuine part of herself and something that makes her whole again is something that Ed can't do, which is part of what makes the final scene of the episode so effective. While the rest of the episode gives us perspective on how much Winry values her skills as a mechanic, we don't really get the full story behind why she values it so much until this scene. Like I said before, it has to do with her growing concerns over Ed and Al, which is a much more emotional reason than than what she had in the manga and Brotherhood. I really appreciate how the dialogue between the two is written here. Winry never outright says that she's worried and that she wants Ed to give up on the Philosopher's Stone, but you can easily pick up on it from her enthusiastic offer to go back to Risenbull and her silent disappointment when Ed decides not to. When she starts talking about her automail, she talks about it as an alternative to the Philosopher's Stone. It's made clear here that she's not just an automail engineer for the sake of being one, she's an automail engineer because maybe one day if she gets good enough, she can fully replace Ed's missing limbs in a way that leaves him satisfied and will get him to come back home. The scene gradually builds to Winry finally being able to express herself through subsequent shots that meaningfully progresses and closes the distance between the two. It starts with 2 establishing shots of the both of them entirely separate and not even looking at each other. Then it cuts, and while the distance between the two is still being emphasized here, they're at least in the same shot now. The final shot of build-up then brings them both closer to you than they ever were. You can still tell that they're sitting on opposite sides of the room, but the space between them doesn't feel as great anymore, and this is when Winry actually starts to open up. It's hard not to feel a little bad for her, since both she and the audience knows what Ed is going to say in response to this, and I like that when he eventually does respond in the way we're expecting, the camera slowly zooms out from the both of them as they just silently sit there, showing the emotional gap widening again. It's a surprisingly tender moment, one that'll take you by surprise on your first watch through, but will also make you think back on all of their interactions throughout the show and not just in this episode. For example, in House of the Waiting Family, when Winry passionately talks about how automail is the best and how she doesn't understand why anybody would want a human arm over a mechanical one. Now that isn't just a quirky joke, it has layers. Maybe this was her way of hinting at what she really felt about Ed and Elle's journey at the time. Maybe that was her genuinely trying to convince Ed that there was no point in getting back what he had lost because she can easily replace it. At least, for him. I guess she doesn't give a fuck about Elle. Regardless, I still think the scene is really sweet, and it's ultimately successful at getting you to sympathize with Winry's emotions. Now, is there anything wrong with this episode? No, it's fun, the character interactions are good, and there's a surprising amount of heart in it as well, but at the end of the day, it's still pretty uneventful. Some minor things happen, like scenes involving Izumi, which are all pretty entertaining and add a layer of mystery to her character before we really get to know her, and now that you know she's going to be a major character, her cameo in episode 23 is something you'll have to look forward to on a subsequent watch through. Also, the way the episode ends with her husband just walking ominously into frame in time with the music is really funny. Mustang also investigates Hughes's death in the background, and while it doesn't go anywhere in this episode, these scenes are still engaging and work well to cast the military in a more suspicious light. The chase scene is fun and it doesn't overstay its welcome. I also love how when Ed saves Panina at the end of it, he does it in such a petty way by making it as painful as possible. I like all of these things, but the point is this episode doesn't really have much forward momentum in it, and on top of that, it's not the most memorable one either. I can't really say I'm excited to get to this one whenever I'm rewatching the show. I can also understand why someone would feel frustrated with the lack of progress in this episode, especially after the bombshell that happened in the last one. At the same time though, it is an enjoyable watch and much more interesting than I remember it being, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Episode 27, Teacher. By now you've probably noticed that I'm watching the sub version of the show for my review of this batch of episodes, and this specific episode is the reason why I'm doing that, and will continue to do that for the rest of the series. Upon revisiting it, I realized that I've come to really despise the word teacher, at least when used in the specific way FMA uses it. I don't know, it just comes off as a little pretentious when someone tries to turn a mundane thing into something more grand and impressive than it actually is. This is alleviated a lot by the Japanese version where they call Izumi sensei, which is just a lot more fitting, so that's why I made the switch. Aside from that, I'm a little mixed on this episode since it does a lot more wrong than I remember it doing on my first watch through, but for now let's talk about the things I did like. The opening scene of this episode is the perfect introduction to Izumi as a character. Within the first minute, she not only establishes how well she knows Ed by cutting off his escape route before even properly entering the scene, but she also shows us exactly why the Elric brothers are so afraid of her. I didn't mention this when talking about Words of Farewell, but I really like the change the show made to this plotline. In the manga, Ed and Elle willingly went back to visit Izumi, but in this version of the story, they want as little to do with her as possible. With this change, Izumi is able to show off what kind of personality she has a lot more, which makes for a much stronger first impression on you as she actually sets off to hunt her students herself instead of just waiting for them to come back. And her characterization throughout the rest of the episode is pretty solid too. Like in this scene of everybody eating together, it hints at what makes Izumi tick as a character through the people around her. The slight change in expression on this guy's face when Al brings up the time they helped deliver a baby, as well as the natural way Mason changes the subject when Rinri asks an uncomfortable question. Letting these reactions speak for themselves is a good way of hinting at the more tragic elements of Izumi's past, and it gives all of the scenes where she talks about her principles in life a lot of weight. While you don't get the full picture of what happened to her in this episode, you are given enough information to get a general idea. Her reaction to Ed performing alchemy without a circle, as well as the knowledge that she can do it too, combined with the fact that she's the only other character we know of who can do this, is suspicious, and that suspicion that she did something similar to Ed is all but confirmed in the final scene of the episode. I can't help but get emotional whenever I watch this scene. This moment just feels so genuine, an honest and heartfelt expression of care and love for these two. It's also a touching moment of sympathy as she's been in a similar situation as they were and can therefore understand what they must have been feeling when deciding to perform human transmutation. I can understand feeling a little conflicted about the But in the context of the show, I don't think it's abusive. The two did a really fucked up thing, so, you know, it makes sense that they'd be reprimanded severely like this. I also think that the guttural and harsh nature of the beating makes the soothing and tender way Izumi comforts the two of them feel much more impactful because of the stark contrast. Seriously, the show doesn't shy away from fully conveying just how violent she's being here, and the complete lack of music only emphasizes that further. So yeah, the gentle weight of her hug wouldn't be as powerful without some form of strict discipline to come before it, but I swear this isn't me advocating for child abuse. Anyways, what I like about this episode I really like, but there's also just a lot of dead space here. One scene showing what Mustang is up to doesn't kill the flow of this episode too much, but do we really need a sequence of all of his subordinates each individually getting a call summoning them, followed by a scene of Mustang telling them that they'll all be transferring to Central with him? And this is just ridiculous too. Like, most of these phone calls can be chalked up to Mustang knowing his troops so well that he knows where they'll be at specific points in their day, but he manages to call Fury under circumstances that he couldn't have possibly predicted. So he specifically came out here to fix that phone, right? And as soon as he finishes fixing the phone, it gets a call and that's how Mustang contacts him? How convenient is that? Did Mustang know he'd be here fixing this phone? If he did, then why did he think calling him would work? Because the phone's kind of broken. Look, the point is, I don't think the sequence was necessary. At the very least, it could have been shortened greatly, kind of like the section of the video I just spent talking about it. I at least understand why this next thing was in the episode, but I also found the flashback of how the brothers met their teacher to be unnecessary information. Like, do we really need to know how these two met Izumi? I wouldn't be complaining about this if the flashback was entertaining in its own right, but it's just not. It's perfectly serviceable in the sense that it does in fact show us how they met their teacher, but there's nothing really emotionally interesting going on in it. It's honestly a pretty bland story that shouldn't have taken up as much time as it did. We don't even learn much about Izumi in this flashback, which seems really weird to me considering that's sort of the point of telling this kind of story in the first place. All of the information we could have learned about her was already told to us before. She's strict, she's scary, she hates data alchemists. The only thing we got from this flashback specifically was the fact that she can transmute without a circle. But does that justify this entire lengthy flashback that dawdles and takes longer than it should to get to the point? This feels very much like an obligatory flashback, which was only put in here to fully adapt the parts of Ed and Nell's backstory that episode 3 couldn't cover. It doesn't help that it's also pretty awkwardly inserted into the plot either, using Winry's poor memory as an excuse to delve into the topic. It drags the episode down severely, and it leads right into that other sequence that I just complained about. After the opening scene, there's pretty much no progression to the plot of this episode until around the 13-minute mark, which kind of sucks. But even when the plot is moving, I just feel like there's a lot of clumsiness in how it moves. For instance, the show has once again used the trope of child does not understand the concept of death and feels emotional over it. I said it in Words of Farewell, and I'll say it again here. This is emotionally manipulative, and this time it fails to work at all for me, because this moment kind of comes out of nowhere. We saw this cat before once, and she was perfectly fine. Then later on in the episode, there's just a dog barking at it while it's on the roof, and when Ed climbs onto the roof, it's there, but it just gave birth, and it's also bleeding. This just feels so random. What could have even happened to lead to this situation? And this part of the episode moves really quickly too, probably because it's trying to get people to brush it aside and not think about it too much, but when you do think about it, it's just clumsy writing. So why the hell am I supposed to care about a cat that I know the writer specifically only made to kill off in a situation that would lead to Ed transmuting without a circle and Izumi seeing that? It's contrived as all hell, and the fact that they try to make this sad is honestly laughable to me. You know, maybe if this episode had spent less time on useless flashbacks and useless things in general, it could have devoted more time to showing Chico gradually losing strength over the course of the episode, or do anything else that would much more naturally build to its emotional climax, which would make that final scene even better than it already is, but that's not what happened. In the end, I feel like the theme of life and death and how those concepts coexist in a cycle doesn't work in this episode because of this fucking cat dying and this girl telling the audience how to feel about that. It more so works because of Izumi's ability to relate to Ed and Elle's greatest mistake. She acted in a way that perfectly captures what's wrong with trying to tamper with that cycle, but still shows understanding of how painful it must be to accept that fact. This is a scene that was born from her own experiences and past mistakes, which is what makes it so goddamn meaningful. And that sunset is pretty too. While extremely messy throughout, this episode does have some really powerful moments in it, and at the end it managed to stick the landing so hard that I think I can justify just barely giving it a 7 out of 10. Episode 28, All is One and One is All. This episode makes use of a pretty clever framing device, bouncing back and forth between two stories, one that takes place in the past where the brothers struggle to survive on this uninhabited island, and the other in the present where they spend most of their time reminiscing about that part of their lives, while also being stalked by some naked guy. The episode is structured so that the past always follows the present. At first you'll see the brothers walking around for a bit, they'll find something that reminds them of their last visit here, and then you'll be shown their memories as well as how what they found relate to their past. Cut back to present, rinse and repeat. It's an effective formula for revealing more and more of what they've gone through on this island, but it's also very gradual. For that reason, this episode can be a bit of a slow burner, but that won't be a problem because it's still pretty damn engaging. There's this seamless flow to the storytelling here, probably thanks to just how seamless the transitions from one timeline to the other are. For example, when Ed and Elle stumble across this pile of leaves, the camera pans down and once it centers, we see Ed's past self overtaking the screen, revealing that the two use these leaves as a makeshift bed, or when Ed and Nell walk behind this tree and then a knife cuts into it, revealing what those marks Ed was looking at earlier were. Something I like about these flashbacks is how we get to see their process for surviving step by step, as well as how it continues to change in response to the many setbacks they experience during their stay here. Each time we cut to these two as children, it feels extremely purposeful, first setting up what their goal is, next showing us what will make this goal hard to accomplish, then having them pinpoint what their priorities should be, and finally giving us perspective on how spread thin they are for resources. The steady degradation of these two being emphasized by the repetition of this shot of the marks in the montage growing in number, as well as the amount of activity between these shots decreasing over time. Between the first and second shots of these marks, there are 4 scenes of these two preparing or trying to hunt for any kind of food, but between the second and third shots, there's only 1 scene of them hiding from the masked man, and when you get to that third shot, we actually see Ed's arm cutting into the tree slowly compared to how he did it at the beginning of the montage, showing that he's a lot more fatigued now, and the rest of the sequence does nothing but confirm this fact. This naturally builds to the two wondering about the concepts of life and death shown to us through incredibly striking imagery, like the cicada being picked apart by a bunch of ants, or the various shots of nature and wildlife going about their business as usual. I especially like the shot of Ed holding up an ant to the moon as the two cap off their dialogue, relating the way the world works to alchemy. This is extremely well done, and if this were the only thing the episode was building towards, I wouldn't have any complaints, as the scene was satisfying in and of itself. But this flashback isn't just a well-told bit of backstory for our main characters, it's also something that's directly related to the emotional arc they're going through in this point of the story. Likewise, the framing device of having Ed and Al reminisce about their time on this island isn't just a means of telling us the story, there's another purpose behind it too. These two versions of our leads are juxtaposed against each other to show the sheer difference in competence between how they were before and how they are now. In the present, it's made clear that they're more than capable of surviving in a place like this. The episode opens with Ed having this confident smile on his face, and the two talk about how easy this will be for them now. Unsurprisingly though, their past selves don't have the same reaction. The presentation of this island does a complete 180 as the episode jumps from present to past. Simple things for these two like procuring food or dealing with wild animals turn into huge trials for them as children. In the present, this might as well be a nice little vacation for the brothers, but in the past, it's a hellhole that pushes them to the brink of starvation. Now, their past selves do have to deal with the terrifying masked man who does everything in his power to constantly deprive the two of food, but they're also clearly held back by their own inexperience. For instance, their inability to kill small game at first limits the pool of resources they can draw from in order to sustain themselves, which is what makes the masked man taking away what little they do have extremely detrimental to them. They're not even very good at catching anything in the first place, as shown by this montage. They spend a good chunk of time chasing birds around without any kind of plan or getting caught in their own traps. They even have to resort to eating questionable mushrooms because of how shit they are at this. Comparatively, the present versions of themselves don't even seem to worry about this kind of thing at all. Even when the fish they caught are ruined and they're faced with the possibility of the masked man being on the island still, they're almost completely unfazed. They even go off looking for the masked man themselves, probably because Ed just wants to beat the shit out of him and settle the score. Point being, they've come a long way since they were kids. They're able to fend for themselves now, both as capable fighters and scavengers. But while this episode makes it clear how they've grown, it also makes a point of showing how they haven't. As the two reflect on the moment they came to understand the meaning behind the phrase one is all and all is one, it becomes clear what Izumi wanted them to realize through coming here again. Just like in that moment when they should have realized transmuting their mother was a mistake, now they should take the chance to reflect on their current path, their journey to get their bodies back, and whether that's something they should stick to. And in response to this question being brought to his attention, Ed shows us exactly what he's thinking as he stares intently into the fire. Even though he's aware this may be the wrong path to go down, that this may lead to his own destruction, his inability to let go of his regrets as well as his desire to make up for what he did wrong drives him to repeat the same mistake he made as a kid. No matter how much he's grown and changed on a surface level, this one part of him has and will keep him from fully maturing. It's a really powerful moment, and the way the rest of the episode builds up to it is nothing short of brilliant. You've probably figured this out by now, but I actually fucking love this episode. It's a 10 out of 10 for me. Hopefully, even if you disagreed with any of my opinions though, you can at least understand where I'm coming from, or maybe I'm just full of shit. Regardless, I'll be going now.